Seek is the self-hosted search, analysis, and alerting server built for structured log data. You can track errors, build dashboards, and configure alerts without sending any data outside your own infrastructure. Try Seek for free on Windows Server or Docker at datalust.co/seq. That's datalust.co/seq. Hi, I'm Scott Hansel, and this is another episode of Hansel Minutes. Today I'm chatting with Rita Kozlov. She's a Senior Director of Product at Cloudflare. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm very well, and I'm excited to talk about Cloudflare because I'm realizing that I grew up in an internet where not only did Cloudflare not exist, but it didn't really need to exist. We would just take a computer and plug an Ethernet cable in, and it was on the internet. Why does a Cloudflare kind of a company need to be a thing?
That's such a great question. And I think there's two slightly different answers to it. One is that probably most of the websites that you visited when you're first starting out on the web were hosted somewhere, relatively speaking, not that far from you. But if you're a kid growing up in Australia, you probably had a pretty vastly different experience of the internet. And actually, funnily enough, my partner is from Australia, so he can recount that pretty firsthand. Then in parallel, the thing that's been happening on the web, right, is that it turned out that it's really hard to actually scale resources. So there's two types of events that can happen. One is you hit really great success, and then you have to figure out how to make things continue running, right? And the second thing that can happen is a little less fun and a little more malicious in intent, and someone can launch a massive attack on you. And so a really great way to solve both of these problems is to have a network of effectively servers that sits in front of, your computer and both protects it from the malicious actors, but also makes a big portion of it available to users right near where they are. So if you are that kid in Australia and you're looking at a website and it has a ton of images, those can actually be served from somewhere near them rather than, traveling all the way back to the United States. And
you're describing a CDN, effectively a content distribution network, right? And the idea that like HanselMinutes.com, the podcast that we're on right now, is in Chicago somewhere. And I got complaints from Australians and Indians that the images page, when we scrolled through 900 episodes, was really heavy. And I thought this was an image optimization problem, but it wasn't. It was 900 images going from Chicago at the speed of light to Australia.
That's exactly right. So the speed of light we have not figured out yet, right? We cannot minimize that time. But what we can do is distribute those resources just a tiny bit closer to where the user is.
Mm-hmm. So that's the CDN problem. That's the closeness that solves some of the physics issues to try to pick something that is near you. But then there's also kind of the threat aspect of things. I remember a couple of years ago, they used to give us a number, which was the number of minutes until a machine was pwned when you put it on the open internet. So you take like an unpatched Windows XP machine, you plug it in and you just stare at it for like 9 to 12 minutes. And then it like bursts into flames because someone found it on the internet. So now Cloudflare, it seems to me, has become the world's reverse proxy. It's the world's firewall.
That's exactly right. And it's kind of crazy to imagine that now it's effectively impossible to exist on the web without at least some sort of level of protection that sits between you and any malicious actor.
Yeah. But the internet is supposed to be distributed. And I realize that Cloudflare has like hundreds of data centers and stuff like that. But is it a good thing that it's not baked into the internet, that like you have to have that kind of level of protection?
That's actually such an interesting question because so much of Cloudflare's hypothesis and mission lies exactly in that question, right? And I think when we were starting to design the internet, we had no idea how it was going to be used, as is the case when you design anything from scratch, right? And so a lot of our mission is actually to help fill the gap of how the internet should work. And Cloudflare's official mission statement, right? We would never say that our goal is to build a better internet. That's not what we're here to do. But we are here to help build a better internet and kind of help, again, plug some of those gaps between this is what we thought things were going to look like and this is what things in reality look like.
That's a good point. I actually have been using Cloudflare for years, but I don't think I've actually ever given you any money. That's an interesting relationship. I've just realized as you're telling me all of this that I'm taking advantage of Cloudflare on so many of my domains. I just kind of take it for granted. How is that okay that I've never paid you for anything?
So we do have a lot of large customers, right, that do pay us money, but we do actually view people being able to stay online, especially as a commodity and something that everyone should have access to. And so having a free plan is something that's been a part of Cloudflare since the very, very beginning. And this is how a lot of people become really familiar with Cloudflare, right? And at the end of the day, we do want you to adopt more of our products and services and build more on us, which I think we'll talk about a bit later as well. And so that initial experience that you have had and so many others have had of being able to get started without having to put down a credit card and knowing that things are going to stay up for, as you said, you've been using us for maybe over a decade and not really thought about it is really, really critical.
Yeah. Here in Oregon, there's a place called Les Schwab Tires. And Les Schwab Tires will pull a nail out of your tire and patch it for free. And they've done it for years. So people around town here will have this relationship with this tire shop. And then they'll always feel like, well, shouldn't I should pay you for fixing the tire. And they'll say, no, just think about us when you have a flat. And every single time we do. So inevitably, they have that loss leader, that free product. But then we always think you get your tires done at Les Schwab. So with Cloudflare, it's just become so ubiquitous when you think about either CDNs or DDoS, which is the other big conversation, those distributed denial of service attacks.
Yeah, I mean, I can't tell you the number of CTOs that I talk to, right, that start talking to us about enterprise level services. And the conversation will start with something like, oh, I've been using Cloudflare for many years for my blog. And we're all nerds at the end of the day, right? No matter what C-level position we're in. And so those blogs might be slightly over-engineered, but that's the introduction for so many people into the product. And then they join a company, they get a stake in what the stack looks like, what those decisions are, and they bring Cloudflare to their company. And that's been a big part of Cloudflare's success story.
Well, and speaking of nerds, I mean, you were a software engineer before. You were also a solutions engineer earlier at Cloudflare, and you did a lot of the work on Cloudflare Workers, which was your serverless platform. Was that when Cloudflare started doing more compute in addition to network infrastructure?
That's exactly right. So I joined Cloudflare at a pretty interesting time, as you mentioned, as a solutions engineer. And we were kind of at that inflection point where a startup goes from being a startup to being a serious enterprise, right? And we're onboarding all of these large customers. And the way that you do that when you're pretty small is when someone needs some sort of insane customization, an engineer like myself would go behind the scenes and go, if the company is hanselminutes.com, then cache a cookie or maybe redirect based on this country or whatever. And we knew that this wasn't going to be sustainable. And so we started thinking about, okay, how do we solve this? And how do we solve this at scale? And how do we allow developers to service themselves? And that was really the introduction of Cloudflare Workers for that purpose. But it turned out that when you're able to deploy code at this massive scale, it actually solves a host of other problems that are actually a lot more interesting in the compute space, right? All of a sudden, you can build an application, it's live in a matter of seconds, and it will literally scale to infinity. You can have 0 requests per second 1 minute and multiple million requests per second another, and it just works. And that was the beginning of our compute and eventually storage offering as well.
You know, I think Cloudflare is extremely well known for absorbing DDoS attacks and basically either spinning up compute in order to absorb them and keep them off of my network and my machines. But we always, I think, as engineers, thought about it as network infrastructure. But you were out there building data centers, hundreds of them. So I guess you had the capacity to then move from that kind of sucking up of CPU via DDoS to then actually providing compute for serverless.
Yeah, I mean, we've always run a compute stack because there's actually quite a bit that happens when you hit Cloudflare, right? The DDoS mitigation itself, there's a lot of detection that happens there. There's all of the routing logic and so much more. And it did actually present an interesting constraint for us, right? So when we started thinking about how do we provide compute to not just a few select enterprise customers, right, to all of the different users that Cloudflare has, we started looking at different options. And we realized that we couldn't go down the traditional route of having containers for a couple of reasons, which is the standard for actually providing CPU and compute, right? The first is so much of our value proposition is actually in making websites faster. And if you spin up a container from scratch, you're going to hit a cold start. It's a large thing. It takes multiple seconds to boot up. And so being able to customize something, but at the same time having it slow down was not really acceptable. So that was one constraint to design around. And then secondly, to your point, right, we do run this massive network and we wanted every single customer to be able to run their code in us. And so again, we wanted to find something that was leaner and was able to run at scale in our network. And so that's where we kind of came up with the V8 architecture that powers Workers today, that is much, much more lightweight, but at the same time is able to scale up and actually run pretty CPU intensive processes as well.
I would think, though, speaking a little bit from a place of ignorance on my part, that I worry about noisy neighbor things in multi-tenancies, right? If you have a bunch of people shoved into an apartment, one person decides to have a party next door, noisy neighbor, and the same thing happens where you have a DDoS, you have a stack that is a compute stack, but is still focused on network and layer 3 DDoS, but then suddenly you're now doing serverless. Is that a problem for Cloudflare?
I mean, we've been in layer 7 for a really long time, actually, right? We've always decrypted traffic to be able to run our WAF and everything like that. So running compute was not particularly new. And again, one of the things that was afforded to us by running the V8 engine. So yes, if we were running containers, that might have been a slightly bigger problem. And it's hard to illustrate how much more efficient an isolate is compared to a container. So just to give you a small example of what happens when you boot up an entire container, you have to basically pull up an entire language runtime, right? So everything that your computer is about to need to know if you're running something like a Lambda, that's what happens when a new request hits it. A worker, by contrast, has their runtime included at all times. So all that it has to pull in is just the code that you're trying to run, which means that it's able to host so many different workers on our network at the same time. And be able to, today we have over 1 million developers that are building on our networks, and we've never hit noisy neighbor problems due to this design.
Let's take a moment, though, just to make sure that we don't lose folks that might be listening, because we throw out acronyms and words that they may not understand. So when you say WAF, we're talking about a web application firewall. And when you say V8, you mean the V8 JavaScript engine itself.
That's exactly right. So V8 was designed actually by the Chrome team. If you are opening a Chrome browser right now, for example, and you have as many tabs as I do, it's the exact thing that keeps those tabs very separate, right? So I don't want my Bank of America app to be able to read any information from my e-commerce app, right? And that's exactly the software that allows us actually to run that separation and multi-tenancy.
Interesting. So then if I think about it in the context of tabs, you've got 42 tabs open. You don't have 42 Docker containers, but you do have 42 and you use the word isolates. Maybe you could dig into it, the concept of an isolate versus a container.
That's right. An isolate was a term that we came up with to encapsulate this much lighter weight, smaller model for being able to run code. So again, if I were to illustrate it versus a container is much more blank when it instantiates. And so there's so much more that it has to pull in. So a similar analogy would actually be if you think about what came before the container, it was a virtual machine, right? And with a virtual machine, you have to pull in the entire operating system every single time. So a container is lighter weight in that the operating system is shared, but you still have to pull in the language runtime, all of the libraries, and the user code. And isolate takes things another step further and only really requires you to pull in the user code, and everything else is shared and included.
Interesting. That's a really good analogy. I like that stack. Again, we're on a podcast, so it's hard to visualize, but if you think virtual machine, container, isolate, that stack is very clear. Now, so you have workers, but now the next obvious step in this world where everyone is saying AI is workers AI, because if you can go and run some compute, there's no reason it can't be GPU compute.
That's exactly right. So we started out with workers, and as I mentioned before, we quickly realized that what we had in front of us was really powerful, and we wanted to enable developers to be able to build any application that they could think of on top of our network. So actually, the thing that came a little bit before AI was storage, because state is such an important part of building an application too. And then if you're talking about building software in the year 2023, then yes, AI has entered the chat and it's a big part of any application that you're trying to run. And so we wanted to make that just as accessible as it was running any other compute, again, at developers' fingertips, all included as a part of the same ecosystem.
Hey friends, working remotely is no longer a luxury, it's a necessity. And as businesses have rapidly transitioned to hybrid or purely remote work, the need for secure, compliant, and hassle-free remote access is paramount. So, what's the simplest, fastest, and secure way to connect to remote Windows computers and apps? That is TrueGrid. It's designed to simplify and modernize Microsoft Remote Desktop services without the fuss. No more exposed firewall ports or VPN. It's a zero-trust remote desktop solution with integrated multi-factor auth. You've got cybersecurity and an insurance-compliant environment. It streamlines your entire remote desktop access, makes you invisible to potential online threats. Everyone authenticates in the cloud before even getting a sniff of your network. And the real game changer, TrueGrid's secure RDP can deliver remote app to any device with just a button press and no latency. If you value your time, your security, and your sanity, TrueGrid is a no-brainer. So if you're ready to transform your remote access setup, get a demo of TrueGrid today at demotg.com. That's demotg.com, and you'll get an exclusive 20% discount on your first purchase. That's TrueGrid. This might be a dumb question, but like when people think cloud, I think they think AWS, they think Amazon, they think Google, and then there's this long tail. Are you officially a cloud? Are you the fourth cloud?
Really great question. So we've been asking ourselves that exact same thing. And you and I have talked about so many different things that Cloudflare does, right? And we haven't even touched on a whole other part of our business, which is our zero trust and ability to secure devices and teams. And so we've also gone on this soul-searching exercise. And the term that resonated with us most that we actually announced pretty recently was that we're a connectivity cloud. And so there's multiple components to this, right? A part of it is being able to run applications on us. A part of it is securing servers. A part of it is securing devices. And a part of it is recognizing that customers do still run in other clouds or on-prem or in other entities, and being able to connect all of those things together.
Yeah. I'm not a marketing person. You're not a marketing person. And I know that people who listen to the show don't want to think about marketing. That said, how people choose to think about a product or a company matters, and picking those words matter. And I notice that if you look at Cloudflare solutions, you see connect, protect, secure, and accelerate. And I think that word accelerate is really interesting, because that's the thing that I always associate with your stuff. It's about taking a thing and accelerating it, like slamming on the gas. And I don't see that word used in the other clouds. They use like words like enable and empower and things like that. It seems like performance is a feature for Cloudflare.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you ask about why use Cloudflare, that's definitely one of the first thing that comes up. I will say that when it comes to building applications in particular, it does tend to be a little bit misleading, because then people start to box themselves in terms of, okay, well, there's certain things that we know are latency sensitive, and the more latency you can shave off, the better returns that you will get. So e-commerce is a great example, where every 100 milliseconds basically means conversion rates, right? It can mean millions of dollars for a particular business. But actually, when it comes to AI, even if a model is going to take multiple seconds to execute, then does it really matter that I'm running near the end user or that I'm running at the edge, so to say? Does it accelerate things that much? And so I think more and more we see that as something that comes out of the box, and we want people to expect from their cloud is that it accelerates things. But we don't want to be boxed in that way of, if you're running on the edge, then that's only for latency specific use cases, if that makes sense.
That's a good point. But accelerate also can mean, from a developer's perspective, on how quickly they can get stuff up. So, if I go to developers.cloudflare.com and I start exploring the Workers, API for Workers AI, it's interesting. I wonder, by going import AI from Cloudflare AI and going right into that, you have a dedicated Cloudflare specific SDK to accelerate things. And then you can go and pick any model that you want. You can say Cloudflare/Meta/Llama or whatever. Is using a Cloudflare SDK something I shouldn't worry about? Or is that vendor lock-in? Should it bother me that there's Cloudflare identity baked into the SDK, or is that silly for me to think?
Vendor lock-in is always one of those things that it's hard to answer questions about, right? It's always going to be a trade-off between, do you want to use the platform to its full capacity and take on a little bit of that risk? Or I also see teams really overthinking this, right? And building everything from scratch. But at the end of the day, that slows down your velocity. And so you kind of have to think about, what is the real value proposition that I'm offering? That said, I want to be very cautious and point out our intent is definitely not to lock anyone in. And so you can actually use Cloudflare Workers, or you can use Workers AI through our SDK and through our REST APIs, which you can call from anything. You can use it through a Workers binding, which is more specific to Cloudflare. And actually, our APIs are pretty similar to other APIs out there. So if you did want to swap, you're not having to rewrite your entire app. And in general, we've leaned as much as possible into open standards, and we've open sourced actually the Workers runtime itself, specifically out of wanting customers to know that they do have a choice to switch off. And we want people to build on us because they think it's the best option, but not out of, feeling like they can't move on.
Right. So in this case, the SDK is designed that way for acceleration and not for any kind of lock-in. And you beat me to it, because you can absolutely drive stick shift if you want to drive stick shift by just calling the REST API. It's no fun to call things with curl when you can do it in 2 lines of JavaScript, but it's definitely cool that you can do that. And then to your point about also being able to do local work, you've open sourced so many things. Can you tell me about what Wrangler is, and what the relationship between me as a dev on a local machine versus doing it in the cloud, and how Wrangler fits into that?
Absolutely. So Wrangler is just the command line interface, the CLI for our Workers product. So if you're using Workers and you're deploying it, that's probably going to be your go-to tool, where you can type in Wrangler init to get a project bootstrapped. You can type in Wrangler deploy to get it up and running on Cloudflare. And you can also use it for the local dev experience. So if you want to test out your code before you hit that ship button, which I think most of us do, then it'll spin up a local development environment that actually now uses the Workers runtime under the hood. So that's one of the things that I think is really cool, is that you don't get those discrepancies between like, oh, it worked on my machine, but now I've pushed it up and something is broken because it works differently in the cloud.
That's cool. So you include a bunch of models, all the obvious and popular models. Can I use my own model, and can I mix and match?
Not today, but that is something that we're hearing a lot of requests from customers for, and definitely something that we want to support in the future.
Okay. So you've got NVIDIA GPUs that are all over the global network. So everywhere you've got compute, you've got GPU compute? Or what do we say? Like, I think compute, I think CPU. What's the word for compute that's GPU?
I've been trying to come up with that term myself, and I have no idea. I will make one tiny correction, which is that we don't have GPUs everywhere yet, but we are in over 50 cities now and are expected to have GPUs in over 100 cities around the world by the end of the year.
Thank you for the correction. That's still a lot. That's
still a lot. Still, chances are, if you're running Workers AI, or if you're connecting to a model that's running you're within, just a few milliseconds of wherever the nearest data center is.
Right. Once you've got that account set up, you've got text generation, you've got speech recognition. You're also doing image classification, even some Microsoft models in there like ResNet as well, which I thought was really cool.
Yeah, we've been working very actively with our partners. So we're very excited actually to get our Hugging Face partnership off the ground that we announced a few weeks ago during our birthday week. And we're really excited actually about how much evolution we've seen in the open source model ecosystem. And again, how much of that Hugging Face has really enabled and being able to share and upload models. And so we wanted to make it as easy as possible to get started with kind of, as you mentioned, some of those basic use cases that we just see every single person that's experimenting with AI right now trying out first.
Yeah. And again, for folks that may wonder what these funny words are that we're saying, Hugging Face is a company out of New York that has a very famous Transformers library, as well as a bunch of resources for building, training, machine learning models. It's so funny because like my wife is a nurse and she comes home and she'll tell me all these like nursing terms and stuff. And she'll be like, yeah, we did a CBC and a Chem 7 and we dip a urine stat. And then I'm like, oh yeah, but we use Hugging Face and Llama to do it. She's like, what are you talking about? I'm like, it sounds weird when you say it too. So like neither of us speak English to each other anymore. These words are all just nonsense.
Especially in the networking space. I remember when I was starting at Cloudflare and wrapping my head around CDN, DNS, DDoS, WAF, and now I'm one of those people. So I really appreciated you calling me out on that earlier.
No, it's totally okay. But like, you're also deeper into this than I am. So like, you're like, oh yeah, layer 7 versus layer 3. I'm like, oh, which layer was the layer that, I'm trying to remember my OSI models from school, but network people are always right there and they know what layer is what.
Working at Cloudflare has been a great boot camp for getting my OSI model right.
You have no choice. One of the things that I'm also digging into and learning about how vector databases work, like suddenly both AI came out of nowhere after 50 years of, it's an overnight success in 50 years is what I say about AI. Vector databases are like now the thing du jour, and you have a global vector database called Vectorize.
That's right. I'm so glad you mentioned this because it's been one of the things when we were first thinking about announcing it or trying to describe it to different people in the company, it was so hard to explain what a vector database is to someone who is not deep in this industry. And I came up with this metaphor, and so I'm excited to test it out. So if you think about AI, right, or a model like a large language model, it's like a person with a lot of knowledge, right? They've lived a life, they've learned a lot of things throughout their life. But one critical thing to know about AI is that it's a bit like a person that has retrograde amnesia in that they can't really learn new things. So whatever knowledge you've had throughout your life, if you've seen the movie 50 First Dates, you're not really acquiring new knowledge after that, right? And so if I'm a company and I want to have something that answers questions about my products, right, I can't really teach it about the products that have come out since that time that the model was trained. What I can do is I can do one of two things. I can provide it with little note cards every time, be like, here's all of my products. And then it can memorize them and then it can answer questions about them. But that's not very efficient. And so vector database is basically like loading all of that new information into memory so that AI is able to answer questions about all of those things. When we started thinking about, okay, we are deploying GPUs everywhere, we want to enable all of these end-to-end applications, chat seems to be the leading interface for how people are now interacting with AI. It seemed like a no-brainer that a vector database and AI would go hand in hand and to offer those together.
Yeah. I was trying to explain it to my 15-year-old, why a vector database is important. And the best I could come up with for my analogy was in the Matrix when Trinity says, I need a B-21-2 helicopter now. That knowledge would have been loaded out of a vector database. And that's how Trinity knew how to fly the helicopter.
That's so much more succinct than mine.
I did not mean to step on your analogy, but you can use that one too.
No, I love it.
She loaded it directly out of Cloudflare Vectorize. People don't realize that, but that's how Trinity knew that. So can I just sign up and go? Again, I've told you before, I'm already a Cloudflare customer for 10 years. I just go to ai.cloudflare.com and sign up with my existing account.
That's right. Or if you log in, you will see it right there in the left-hand panel. We now have an AI section. There's Workers AI in there. There's Vectorize and our AI Gateway, which was the other product that we released. And you can just start hammering away at any of those.
So last question, and I think this is the most important one then. I work at Microsoft in my day job. This is not my day job. This is just my podcast. But I've got an account at Heroku, and I've got stuff running at Heroku. I've got accounts at AWS, and I've got a bunch of stuff on Azure. Where do I fit Cloudflare into my relationship with these other clouds? And how do I reconcile these things? Because I don't want to just pick one, but I want to use the best product for the best thing.
I'm going to give you a biased view, which is obviously that I think you should run anything and everything at Cloudflare. But to put a little bit more nuance on it, actually, you touched on it a little bit before in terms of accelerate, meaning not just accelerating websites, but productivity as well. And I love Heroku, but unfortunately, that's one tool that's going away, right? And one thing that our team has a bit of an obsession with is Cloudflare is generally known for time to first byte, but our team is obsessed with time to first dopamine, is what we like to call it. And so that feeling as a developer of, wow, I got something up and running very, very quickly. And so if you haven't had a chance to try out Workers yet, it really does seek out to provide that magical experience of being able to get up and running as quickly as possible. And so that's become my go-to tool for whenever I need to deploy either a bit of code really, really quickly. But the same thing goes for entire applications. And I think that's where you can save on developer productivity on either side of the process, right? So yes, you'll get up and running really quickly, but also at the end of your development journey, you don't have to think about, okay, now I have to do all of this work to do scaling or to actually make it be really, really performant, because all of that comes out of the box. And so that's where we see Cloudflare Workers fitting in, or, basically our entire development stack is for enabling teams to go really, really fast. And if you're familiar with existing tools in the cloud, like if you're developing things on Azure or on AWS, the experience that we provide is much lower friction. But again, I also sometimes think that the thing that you're going to be the fastest with is the thing that you're going to be familiar with.
I really like that juxtaposition between time to first byte, which is very physical, and time to first dopamine, which just draws a really analogy to like how I feel about using a particular stack. 5 minutes to wow is always the goal for people who are customer obsessed.
That's right.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Rita Kozlov, for hanging out with me today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been such a pleasure.
I've been learning all about Cloudflare and Cloudflare AI. You can check it out at ai.cloudflare.com. And this has been another episode of Hansel Minutes, and we'll see you again next week.